All right, welcome back. We are COMP123, that's Programming 2 in the summer 2020 semester at Centennial. And it's week 8, part 2 of our broadcast. We're going to talk about UI controls and how to use controls today. But first, what I want to start with is our midterm test details, which is going to be due this Friday. So again, your midterm test should be available now on eCentennial. So if you actually look at eCentennial. All right, so let's take a look at that. So from a details perspective, here is the document. There we go. And you can see that what you're making is a console lottery number picker. Oh yeah, it's a interesting thing. It's due again week 8, that's this week, July 17, 2020 by midnight. We're 25% of your grade. And basically what you're going to be doing is working alone. You will create a console app that randomly picks lottery numbers from a list of 2 different games. Okay, so for those people who don't know what a lottery number is, it's just a series of numbers as random. It's a game of chance, and usually you get some kind of reward for it. In terms of money, sometimes you can win millions, but not really. Not really in terms of the chance of you winning the lottery. And this is my opinion, of course, is that you might as well get struck by lightning. So it's pretty impossible, but it's fun, and some people just use it for that reason. So it's a game of chance anyway. So you may choose to include additional games for bonus marks. I'm not really going to enforce this one at all. I don't recommend doing this one. This is what I normally do, so I've removed the bonus, even though I kind of put that in there. So I'm just going to take that little line out on myself. So there is no bonus for this one. There's too much to do as it is. When the user chooses one of the lotto game options, the program will randomly generate 6 or more lottery tickets and nicely display them on a console. Lottery tickets will be different depending on the game chosen. See below. The program will display a message to the user, press any key to continue, and take the user back to the main menu options. Okay, so there's different games. As an example, the ones I want you to create are Lotto Max and Lotto 649. These are these actual games that exist in Ontario, where we're at. There's also a couple of other ones that I've listed here just in previous times when I've done this version of the midterm test. I've allowed you to do other ones. Please don't do these 2, Lotterio and Pick 4. Just do the first 2. And notice it says non-repeating as a limitation. So you randomly generate numbers, but the numbers that are generated cannot repeat. So you can't have 2 5s or 2 17s. You only can have one number, 7 numbers from 1 to 49, and they must be unique. All right, so they can't be repeating. Okay, same thing with 6 numbers from 1 to 49. So you're going to do random number generation or pseudo random number generation for this example. Okay. You're going to make an abstract class called Lotto Game that has or completed, actually it's already started for you, that has the following shape. This is the shape. Parts of the abstract class have been completed for you, including the constructor method and inherited toString method. Those have been completed. However, there are parts of this class that are not done. Okay, so there's going to be errors running it. And if you actually look at the code that I've given you, and I'm just going to bring up that right now. So if I look at the midterm test, so here is this is the example that I've given you. This is the template that I've given you to work with, okay? So please, again, work with the template. Don't make your own. It'll make it easier for you to get it done. If you start from scratch, you're going to have to do all this by yourself, and there's no need. I also put some additional information here. So example, it'll be things like, this is the driver class. Okay, here's where we instantiate. So the instantiation and all that stuff has already been done for you. There's parts of this that have been already done for you. So you don't have to do a lot of this by yourself. But there's going to be parts of it that has errors. Here's some errors. Right now, why is there errors? Because there is no generate lotto numbers method for Lotto 649 class. And there is no generate lotto numbers method for the Lotto Max class. It doesn't exist. That's why there's errors. So if you were trying to run this template right now, it would error out. Okay? So I'm running this in a switch case statement. This is your menu. All right, so the menu has kind of been created for you already. That's what this is. That's what this looks like. All right, so that's what you start off with. This is the program class. And then you have your Lotto game abstract superclass. The abstract superclass is incomplete. Okay, there's things that are missing. Take a look. Create private fields here. Create public properties here. All that stuff is missing. You have to make them all according to these things. And I've already scaffolded out how it's supposed to look in your constructor. So this is the constructor. There are things that are missing that you have to fix, that you have to make sure that they work, okay, the way that they're supposed to, okay. Once you do that, you have to complete the class. Now, completing the class, I'll be honest with you, is much harder than making the class from scratch, right? So, so please follow the documentation. So if you look at the documentation here for Lotto Game, make sure you cover all these things: fields, the element list, which is a list of ints, and so on. Make sure that all these are satisfied before you get into the algorithm that you need to create for your random number stuff. Okay, so that's all this stuff. It's kind of I've kind of commented it so that you know where everything goes, and it's the same thing for the two other classes, the subclasses, Lotto 649. Right, you can see that Lotto 649 inherits from Lotto Game, which is the abstract superclass, and also implements the iGenerate Lotto numbers interface. But guess what? That interface and the whole file doesn't even exist yet. Okay, so you need to do this. You need to kind of create that for yourself. And the same thing goes with Lotto Max. Lotto Max inherits from Lotto Game and implements the iGenerate Lotto numbers interface, but that doesn't exist. You need to fix this. And you can see that this class is pretty empty. You can see it says create the public generate Lotto numbers method here. If you don't have that, nothing happens. And again, for instructions on how to do this, you follow the document. So please follow the document. Make sure this is good. Follow what it says here. And then as you get to here, it tells you to create, you have two subclasses, Lotto 649 and Lotto Max. And notice what they do here. This little mark says you have to follow generate Lotto numbers, iGenerate Lotto numbers in interface, and this is they're both the same thing. Look, they both implement the iGenerate Lotto numbers interface. There's only one interface that I want you guys to implement, right? So it tells you this. Notice that each of the concrete subclasses implements the iGenerate Lotto numbers interface. You will need to create this interface, which defines the public method generate Lotto numbers. So this is what it tells you to do. So please follow this, okay? And it gives you some examples of what the menu will look like and some output. This is what the output that I'm looking for is supposed to look like when you're done, okay? And to prove this to you, I'm going to close this little file down. So this is the file that you get, okay? So it has a default, and I've included this, I've uploaded this to eCentennial. But I'm going to show you the solution output, so you can see what the solution output looks like. So you can see what I'm talking about. So this is the solution output. Just make sure that that is, yeah. 1 second. I'm just going to, yeah, it looks pretty safe to do anyway, but I'm just going to do one of these and then run it so you can see what it looks like. So you can see now that I have iGenerate Lotto numbers, which is the interface, and what it would look like is something that looks like this, right? So Lotto 649. I press 1, and then I get these. I press any key to continue. It takes me back to the menu. Press 2, generates these numbers. Press any key to continue. And depending on what I pick, I'm going to get a different set of numbers every time. That's what I'm looking for the output. So pretty straightforward in terms of how to generate this. Okay. So that is what I'm looking for your midterm. It talks about how to create this. Please follow the instructions. There's internal documentation requirements. Make sure you hit these. They're worth 6 marks out of 50. So things like a comment header for all your methods and classes that you create. GitHub is required. It's worth 4 marks out of 50. Make sure you get that done. And you're going to create a short video presentation. This should actually not be indented. There should be actually something that looks like this. But anyways, that's fine. I don't know why it's 6 here and 5 there. But anyways, whatever. So that same thing that we got for your last assignment should be there. The only difference is that you're going to be showing me your program.cs, your Lotto game CS, your Lotto 649.cs, and Lotto Max files. I also wouldn't mind if you show me your interface, but go through it like you normally do. The video should take no more than 5 minutes. One thing that I forgot to put here, and I need you to a link to your video is what I forgot to put on the description. So please make sure you follow this because I need a link to your video. One thing that I will not do, I'm just going to let you know right now, is I'm not going to accept your midterm test without a video. If you don't make a video, no midterm test. I'm not going to give you marks for it. So please make sure that you have your video working and that I can hear it and see what you're doing. Okay, why? Academic integrity. And link to your video should be from a kind of video streaming provider, such as, and I'll say YouTube preferred. Okay. Again, I'll update the documentation on the assignment for you guys. Okay. So this is required. All right. So without this thing, like I said, I will not mark your midterm tests. Okay. I need you to do this video thing. And again, use the same kind of functionality that I recommended before, which is maybe you can use OBS or some other kind of capture that I'm looking for. The whole thing is worth 50 marks, but it's worth not 15%. Wow, I totally messed this up. 25% of your mark for this course. That's what this thing is worth. So I think it's worthwhile for you to do this. If you've been working on your assignment, the one I gave you, take a pause because this is worth more than your assignment is worth, and it's due this Friday at midnight. So still lots of time to do this. This assignment usually takes students about just under 2 hours to do with everything. So it's like timed so that way if you're good at coding, then you should be able to finish it within the class time frame. So it shouldn't take you that much longer with the video requirements. So the video might take you 10 minutes to create. Maybe you're going to make it a couple of times. So it'll take you 10 minutes more than normal. But it's required. Okay, without the video link, like I said, I'm just going to put like a little important note here so you can see it. I'll say important. Midterm assignments, or I'll say your midterm test will not be marked. All of that. Your midterm test will not be marked without a working link to your demo video. Okay, so I'm going to put that in bold. I'm going to put the whole thing in red so you guys can see it. So that is super important. It's super important that you get this done. Otherwise, what's going to happen is I won't know it's you. I want to hear your voice. I want to see you explain stuff, which is partly what this is all about. So make sure you go through the code and get this done. So it says Lotto 649, Lotto Max, and we'll also include the I generate lotto numbers interface. That's what that is, right? So, because I want you guys to explain that as well. Okay, because without these files, like you going through and explaining how things work, again, I think it's a great opportunity for you guys. I know this is somewhat of a bother where you look at this and go like, why do I have to explain how my code works if it works? No. Yeah, you got to explain to me what you did. So I'm hoping that what you're going to do is go through it and discuss how it works, figure it out over the next couple days, and get it done. And I think this is a great opportunity for you guys because, again, like I said before, you'll be talking to people during an interview, especially a prospective employer, and they're going to want to know how you feel, how you think in terms of a programming, how you program stuff. And guys, if this is going to be your career, if this is really what you want, then I think it's a great opportunity for you to practice talking about programming. Okay, so make sure you do that, and don't try and skirt around it in any other way. Okay. If you make the video private, I give you a link, you can access this, right? No, you cannot. I can't see a private video unless you give me unless you give me as an example your password, right? So what I recommend is making it unlisted. Don't make it private, make it unlisted. As long as you give me the link to an unlisted video, the only people that can see your video are the people you share it with, right? So they can't find the video online. If they look on YouTube and they try and search your channel, they can't find the video. So again, make it unlisted. Okay, that's the easiest way, and it'll prevent any other issues. Okay. Any other questions around midterm tests or the video? I know I went through it pretty lickety-split, but I want you guys to go through it and then try and read what I've asked you to do. I think it's pretty straightforward. It's a console app that's going to look like this. This is the output examples that I want you to create. You're going to make a little menu, and again, part of this is already done for you inside of your program.cs class. Okay, so it's not like you're starting from scratch here. I've actually created a scaffold for you to get this all done, and I've given you a template for you to start with. Okay, so that's this. Again, I'll update the documentation later on today. Do we have to create IO file in midterm tests? No, you do not. There's no IO file. I haven't made that for you. Okay, so there's nothing for you to do. Is it compulsory to show a video talking? I mean, is it compulsory to show your face? No. I don't need you to show your face. All I need you to see is your voice. Your voice is very important on the video, and I need to hear what you're saying. Remember that I'm going to be looking for consistency in terms of the way you're talking, so you don't have to show your face. I mean, it's not that important. I just want to hear your voice. I want to hear you explain stuff and talk to me about the video, right? Talk to me about your code, which is the most important part. Okay? Any other questions before we move on? Okay, I'm sure you're going to have questions. Remember, here's a couple of pointers for you guys, okay? Things that I do not want you to do. Okay, so don't do the following things, and I'm going to start talking about UI controls in a second. 1, don't ask me for an extension. There are no extensions. This is a midterm test. So if you can't get it done by Friday night at midnight, then you get 0. All right, that's pretty much how it is. Okay, so no extensions or anything else. So don't try and submit your stuff at 11:59 on Friday evening. Okay, don't do that. It's not really smart for you to do that. Okay, you want to do it a lot earlier than that, and don't give yourself, even though that's the limit, that's like the very last minute that you can get it done, right? But what you want to try and do is target 11 o'clock p.m. If you're gonna go to the last minute, your last minute should be 11. And if there's any problems or if you have to resubmit, then you do that during the time frame between 11 and 12. Okay. But you do not submit later than 11. Stop doing coding and all that kind of stuff a lot earlier. Try and target even an earlier time. Your code freeze time for your midterm test should probably be something around 9 p.m. on a Friday night. Okay, so no later than 9. Okay, if you go beyond 9, I mean, again, now you're coding. You have to troubleshoot. You have to debug. You have to do all those things. It's not a really great way of doing things. In fact, like I said, get this done as soon as possible. Get it done now. Like start like after this if you can. If you have time between now and Friday, get her done. Because remember, this is geared for around 2 hours. Don't try and and put this off until the last day. It's not going to help you. And working with other people, hey, what did you do? What did you do? What did you do? It's just going to hurt you in the long run, guys, because these courses build on one another. It's not something that, as an example, that, if you try to go into the next course after this one, the expectation is you know how to do the work that's in this course. So working with other people, it's not allowed on this one. It's only for you to work alone. That's why it says working alone. right? It's open book, open internet, right? That kind of stuff, which means you can look at the internet for examples or whatever. But my expectation is that you will not work together in any way. That is my expectation. If I find out or figure out that you've worked with anybody else, you and the other person or people will all get 0. And I've done this before in the past, sadly. I don't want to do that, but I'm just telling you in advance so that way everyone's clear on it. That my expectation is this is your life, this is your career. Please, I would ask you, have some integrity and work on your own. Try and do this stuff on your own, because if you can't do this, then when it comes to your career later on, it's going to really impact you. Okay, so that's just me. Okay, so then part of it's explanation, and you're gonna hand this in, and then you should be fine after Friday. Okay, and it's going to help you if you do this one, and this might be your first video you're giving me, because remember you're going to do another one for abstract planets. It's going to force you to go through this route and create these things. I guarantee you that other professors are going to be asking you for this in the fall for your courses that are online, and so on. So get practicing with this, and don't resist. Okay, I know some people are like, well, I don't like making videos. I don't like my voice. I'm not a native speaker, so I can't speak very clearly, and they give me a lot of excuses. But at the end of the day, guys, is the best way to get better at it is to do it, right? So like I've said to you before, so just take your time. Even if you have to make a couple of attempts at your video, you have time between now and Friday. It's not like you're going to do things last minute. So like I said, if you target, let's say, code freeze at the latest 9 p.m. on a Friday, you have 3 hours to make your video and submit your all the components you need. Other things that I would recommend is please don't start your GitHub repo late. Remember that one of the requirements is GitHub, and what you want to do is you want to initialize your Git repository as early as possible and make several pushes to GitHub. Otherwise, you'll lose marks there too. All right, so GitHub, there's 3 things I'm looking for: a zip archive. Okay, I'm not looking for RAR. I will not accept RAR files. A GitHub link, right, to your repo. And the third thing that I'm looking for is your video, which is important. That's why it's also worth 10 marks out of 50, by the way. I mean, as an example, if you don't get it done, then you won't get it done. But that 10 marks out of 50 actually is a gift, because think about this. Everyone needs to do the video, right? So if you just do the video, you get 10 marks out of 50. That's pretty good, right? In terms of your, the ratio. That's where 20% of your test is to do the video, right? Which has nothing to do with C#. Now that will change going forward. It's going to be worth a lot less, but this is your first attempt. I want to make sure that it's important for you guys to do it, that it's worthwhile. If I make it something like 5%, people aren't going to do it, and then I'm not going to get what I need, which is getting you guys to do your video. Okay, let's get to this next part. So again, I've covered everything up to about 10 or 5 minutes to 11. I want to spend the rest of the time doing the next piece, which is really talking about controls and some of the stuff that it talks about here. So really what we're going to be talking about as a review is adding more types of controls to the form. So we've talked about forms from last day, and let's get into that. So I have your... We created a folder, right, as an example for this one. So, for your files, right? And if I was to, let's run Visual Studio 2019 now. By the way, for those people arriving late today, right, I did speak about your midterm test. Please see the fine video. I will not repeat that stuff. From about 10 o'clock to 10:55 now, I've been talking about the midterm test. So please look at the fine video earlier, and then you'll have that information. Okay, so last day we talked about week 8, part 1. This is the one I'm looking at here. I'm just going to launch this thing. And what we talked about user interfaces with C#, and we're using Windows Forms, which is an older kind of Windows UI platform. That's what it is, but it's still being used in a lot of places today. Banks still use it. Government still uses it here in Ontario when they come to making user kind of forms. Different places, and why it's a quick way of making a little application with a user interface, and it's really a drag and drop interface for the most part. Okay, so we talked about how to do this. We created this little interface, and when we ran it last day, it kind of looks like this. We run it, and you have this little window that pops up, and you can see that we can minimize it, and we can kind of X out of it, so stop it. We can put your name in there. As an example, when I click me, it says hello Tom, right? And if I click me again, it goes clicked, and you can switch between these two things. Okay, so that's what we did last day. Very straightforward. I talked about a bunch of things last time, just a review. I have this window, the properties window. Okay, here's the properties window. And the properties window is context sensitive, which means that if I click the form, then this is going to show the form. And notice up here it says Hello World Form, System Windows Forms Form. Okay? But if I click, let's say the button, it goes Click Me button, System Windows Forms button. Okay, so it's a different context. And you can see the name of the button, this name in brackets, like I talked about before, again, a review of what we did, is the actual variable name of the button. If I click on the label and I scroll up, you can see this is the variable name of the label, welcome label, and so on, right? And here's the other parts, name label, right? Name text box. Text boxes are interesting because we can get input from them. That's an input mechanism. A label is an output mechanism, and the button is a interface element that we can kind of work with. I also briefly talked about the structure of your form, and that we use something called partial classes. So notice that when I go to this CS file, you can do it in a couple of ways. If this wasn't open, I'm just going to close these off for a second. So let's suppose you started off with something like this, and you went to Hello World Form and double clicked. You would see the design, and it actually says design up here. But if I want to see the code behind file, the code file, there's two ways to do this. You can right click on the form and go to view code, or press F7. So if I go to F7, you can see that I can see the code now, and then it shows us that this class is a public partial class, which derives from or inherits from form. That's what it does. So here is your Hello World form, and here's your partial, or this is your superclass. Okay, and the other part of the class, so this is one part of the class, and the other part of the class is in something called the Hello World Form Designer.cs. And I showed you this last time too, and I said largely, guys, don't touch this file. You don't need to. It gets automatically generated. So a lot of the form data or code is automatically generated for you in here, inside of this little section, this region, which basically says Windows Form Designer generated code. So this is nothing that you do. This is done for you when you drag and drop stuff. And there's an order to this stuff. I mentioned the order. If you notice down here, this is where they kind of, these are all the private instance variables, if you will, or fields. Okay. Now, in my opinion, from a convention perspective, if I was going to make this from scratch, I would be renaming these things. So that instead of welcome label with a W, and because it's private, I would probably make this lowercase. But the reason why this works for us is because these are not properties, these are fields. And when I create these things on the design side, it creates these private fields on the on the code side. Okay, so that's what it does. And then once they're created here, so these are, I'm just going to put some comments in here. You can do this. These are private instance variables, right? Or fields. That's what they are. They're inside of the designer. Okay, that's where they get created automatically when you drag and drop a UI element inside of the design. So when I drag and drop stuff from my toolbox, and again, toolbox was another area that I had in here that we talked about, right? So we've talked about a couple of these. One of them was the button, another one was the label, and then we also talked about a text box, which is like an edit text from an Android perspective, all right? Or a text, an edit UI edit object, or whatever you want to call it. That's what this text box is. So I've dragged some of this stuff. Once I drag it onto the form, what I'm doing is I'm composing the form class automagically, I think is the right way to say it, with different elements. And we're using composition, like I said, not inheritance for this. So a great exercise here would be to see our class diagram. Let's take a look at our class diagram here. All right. So again, to get the class diagram, we're going to go here to the actual project. Right click, and I'm going to add. Now it says if I want to, there's a bunch of things in my quick hit menu here that I can add. For example, I can add a new class. I can add a new component, a new user control. This is a custom user control. We're not going to do that right now. Or I can just go new item, and if I go to new item, what I want is a class diagram. So here's the class diagram, and again, you need to enable this inside Visual Studio Installer for you to see this part, class diagram. I'm going to click add. The class diagram is an empty canvas in the beginning. It looks like this, nothing in it. But the great thing about this is if I drag and drop my form, this form here, inside of the class diagram, right? And what you can do is you can expand it, so display the full signature, right? As well as expand the class so it can show you everything. Okay, so if I open it up and I show the full signature of the class, expand the form. Okay, now take a look at that, what it shows you. You can drag this around. It shows you that fields are click me button, name label, name text box, welcome label. All these fields are right here. Right here are the methods that are, and one of them is built in, dispose and initialize component. Notice that they're grayed out. It says required method for designer support. Do not modify the constants of this method with the code editor. Look, it says the same thing. Clean up any resources being used. Any kind of context is here for you, right? So that's awesome. So it gives you the idea of what the class looks like. But what's really awesome is if I right click on this thing and I say show base class, right? Then what Windows does for you, or Visual Studio does for you, is actually create the form class for you. So it actually shows you the form class. And this is where these are all the properties, as an example, that all forms have. Take a look. These are all the properties. There's a ton of properties here. It's so massive. And this is where a great example, which I like, because think about this. These are all your properties. Here are your methods. And here are all the events that have been pre-created for you. They're just not connected to anything right now. But these are events for the form itself, okay, that are built in. Okay, so almost like there's a form life cycle, okay, that we're going to be talking about in a second. But you can see that there's also nested types. So there's a control I collection, which is an interface, and so on. Okay, so this is all part of the form class. And now we can simply see this, that inheritance. We talked about inheritance over the last few weeks. And remember that this class here, Hello World form that you made, inherits from this big massive class here, form. Okay. I want you to think about this, right? Because guess what? This also inherits from another class. So I'm just going to kind of come over here like this, put this over here. I'm going to right click and I'm going to say show base class. And you can see that it inherits from something called container control. All right. And I'm going to open this one up. And you're going to see that I'm going to open this wider. So this is this container control class. Take a look. So form, which is massive, inherits from container control, which is also big. Okay. So this is container control. All right, and actually let's make this like this, and just so we can see that there's properties and methods and events that it inherits from. Okay, and container control inherits from scrollable control, Let's make that happen. So we'll show base class. Here's scrollable control. Okay. I want you to understand the scope of what you're doing here. How big these classes are at the bottom. All right. So that means that this inherits from this. And let me just make this field small. So this is our little form, our little hello world form. And then I'm going to ask you some questions about this just from an understanding perspective. Take a look here. So here's class after class after class, you know, and notice that this one, container control, implements the iContainer control interface. And this one, scrollable control, inherits from iComponent and, implements iComponent and iDisposable interfaces. Okay, so a couple of interfaces, plus it also inherits from control. Okay, let's look at that show base class. Here's my control base class. Okay, let's see if I can put this on this side here. Here's the control base class, and the control base class implements all these interfaces, plus it looks like this. Okay. Okay. Again, I want just to understand the scope of what we're doing here when we make a form. Okay, because people don't really understand it until they actually do it. Okay, so just to give you a sense of how massive these classes are down here. I'm just going to put this over here for now. Okay, so all right, and then control inherits from component. I know I'm going crazy here, but I want to keep doing this and see how this works. Okay, here we go. And then component inherits from marshaled object. I'm not even going to open those up. Okay, so marshaled object, which is the abstract class. Look at this, the abstract class that all other things inherit from. So this, my friends, is the base class. This one right here, marshaled by ref object. That's what it's called, actually. It's a really weird name for the class, but there's a reason for it, of course. So if I open this one up, these are the methods that it starts off with. Create object reference, get lifetime service, initialize lifetime service, marshal by reference object, and a bunch of other ones. Member-wise clone, right? These are all methods that every one of these other classes have access to. All right, starting with the abstract class. Okay, so then you can see that component inherits from marshal ref object, plus implements two things, iComponent and iDisposable, right? Okay, notice that this is also implementing iComponent and iDisposable here, but it's doing it here. Okay, it's interesting that it's done this way, and it's pretty massive, right? So how big then would your form be? This one down here. This is the way it goes. It goes from here to here to here, from here to here to here to here. So we're down like, I don't know, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 classes down, all right, in the inheritance chain. Okay, so this is a massive class. Form actually is huge. It's massive, right? It takes up a lot of memory. So if I make a copy of my form and pass it to another object, memory-wise, it's massive. And this is why later on what's happened is that the whole architecture of the .NET framework moved away from Windows Forms into something else because of how massive, how many different classes are up, kind of upfield from the base class that we're working with, which is the form base class. So form is actually massive. Container control is massive. Scrollable control is massive. Control, and these are all more and more, bigger and bigger and bigger as we get down to this one. This looks like it's small, but actually this is packed full of information, and that's why when it comes to going to this hello world form, and you're like, hey, look, I got a hello world form, and I have access to all these properties in my properties window. Well, of course you do, because you've inherited all those properties from 6 classes upstream. Okay, that's why it's massive. Okay, so questions around this. I wanted to show you the inheritance chain. I think it's super important to understand this kind of thing, because this might give you a sense of how inheritance works in the real world. This is a real world example of a form that you might create. Let's say it's not really that awesome, but we haven't even done a full application. This is one form of a potentially multi-form application that we'll have, and every single time we make a form, we inherit all that stuff inside of it. When we make an instance of that form, it's pretty big. It's pretty big. How big it is, right? Pretty clunky. Okay. But the reason why it's like this is because what Microsoft has done is they've made a generic system for creating Windows applications. And the API, which is all of those classes, the application programming interface they've created, which includes all that class structure that we saw, right, is pretty flexible. You can make a lot of stuff with, by dragging and dropping some forms. So for people who aren't as savvy at a low level in terms of creating all this structure, this windowing structure for yourself, they've done all the hard legwork for you, right, as an example, and created a lot of these classes ahead of time. Now, one thing to also note, I'm going to talk about this too, right? Some of these fields, okay, I'm just going to go up a step just to the form level, okay? If I look at properties, okay, just for the form, notice that the properties accept button, as an example, is of type iButtonControl. The active form is of type form. These are references to, forms and so on, right? So a lot of these properties that we have here, some of the types are also specialized types. For example, rectangle. That's not a float or a string. That's something else. That's a custom type. Point. That's a custom type. Dialog result. That's a custom type. Form border style. That's a custom type. So there's a lot of composition here, along with the inheritance. Lots of composition. Composition means I'm using an object inside of the class that has been created by using a custom class. So some of these custom classes here, as an example, like auto size mode. Auto size mode is the type, right? Dialog result is the type. Then there's other simple types like bool. Bool are this kind of like primitive types, right? Size, though, is not a primitive type. Size is a kind of a custom type, right? So you can see that. And every time I click on any one of these things on the right here, you can see, kind of the name, maximum size, the inheritance modifier, override, auto implemented false, accessors read write, access is public, for all this kind of stuff. Each one of these things, I'm looking at the form class itself to look at these things, right? Even if I go up a step to properties here in my container control, again, if I just look at those, you can see that some of them are control, size F, binding context, create params. These are all custom properties again. So never mind that we're accessing 6 forms up, but each of these forms, for the most part, have fields. Some fields are primitive, like integers. This is great. And properties, for example, size and point and rectangle, that are not primitive, kind of up a step. And also inherit from these interfaces like iComponent and iDisposable and so on. These are all interfaces that are also included. They implement these interfaces as well. Okay? So, again, I just wanted to give you the scope of what you're doing here in terms of when you make a class. And I don't want to scare you away, but this is the details that you're going to have to look at. Maybe in the real world you're going to work on an application or in a project, and you need to understand the class structure. And a great way of doing this if you're programming in C# is by, hey, make that class diagram. Throw things in there. Show the base classes. See the relationships from one class to the other. Try to understand the inheritance hierarchy, right? So that way you know what is made up of them, and on the bottom, how these things all link together. This is kind of an important way of doing things. Okay, so that's just this. Any questions around the class hierarchy for my form? It's there. I'm going to save this as classdiagram1.cd, and it's going to be up on GitHub in a second. So here's class diagram 1. I'm going to go into Team Explorer, and I'm going to go into changes, and you can see that I've modified a couple of things here, but class diagram 1 is what I've added. I'm going to say that I added class diagram, right? Which is important. Commit all. I'm going to go to home, sync, and push, and that's going to push everything up to GitHub. And again, I recommend using this workflow when it comes to doing your midterm test as well as your assignments. Okay, it's kind of it's built in. There's no other tool that you need, and you should be good to go. Okay. All right, so there we go. So there we have a very simple form. Now, we want to get into more complex things. We talked about here in the second document, the second PowerPoint talks about buttons. It talks about labels, the Form 1 designer file and what it does, how it creates labels, what it does, and so on. I think this is an important stuff. We've covered a lot of this already. We can do a couple things here. Here, they're actually showing how to create a font of your own. But a lot of times what we can do is we can do this kind of stuff inside of our form. We don't have to do it in the designer. I don't recommend touching the designer at all, actually. Try and do all this kind of stuff programmatically if you're going to change anything, to inside of your form.cs, whatever the form is called. For example, hello world form. Okay, so again, I would go to hello world form, and if I wanted to modify a component, right? One thing to note is let's talk about a couple of things. Okay, when you load your form, the form itself has different events that are automatically triggered, if you will. Okay, so an event, remember what it is? It's some kind of almost like a signal or a message that gets created inside of the class, of the code, right? When something occurs, when there's a user interaction. So, example, when I run this program and I hover over the button, right? When I'm hovering over the button, what I'm actually doing here is creating an event, right? I've got the hover event. I'm triggering the hover event. And when the hover event is triggered, it changes the style or the look and feel of the button. Okay, that's what it does. And the same thing goes when I hover over the text box. You can see as I hover over the text box, a couple things happen. One, my cursor changes, so it looks like it's the edit version of the cursor. And then you can see that the cursor here is flashing as well when I hover over it, right? So I hover over it, you can see the cursor flashes. If I click the Click Me button, I generated the event. So the Click Me button listens for the event to occur. It's waiting for me to click. Because I've created this event handler, and I've linked the event handler to the event listener in my form. And I've done that by dragging and dropping or double clicking. So in my Hello World form designer, this part, if I just double click on an element, it does two things. It creates the method, the event handler, and also, I also mentioned last day that there are, in your properties, if I click on the button, on the right, there is this events lightning bolt, and it tells you all the events that you can trigger on this control. Remember, the control itself, button, is inherited from other controls, right? Remember that. So look what it says. Like System Windows Forms button. That is the class that I'm using to make my button, right? System Windows Forms button. Okay. And it has all of these events built into it. Okay. It's just that these events, as an example, are not generated, all right, at all. They're not triggered because I haven't connected them to anything else. So I haven't connected, the only thing, the event that's connected is the click event. The click event is being listened to now. So when I click on the button, it's listening, and then it's connecting to this Click Me button click method that automatically gets generated when I first create the event. Okay? And that right now, like we talked about, is here inside of my code behind file. Okay, so this is the little event that gets generated. Okay, I'm pointing this out to you guys because I really want you to understand kind of the anatomy of the form a little bit. But there's something else we can do too. We can wait for the form to start, the form to load before we do something. Okay, So let's suppose I want to do this. I don't want the button to be available to me until my user enters their name. And when they enter their name or enter anything in here, then the button becomes available. Okay? Or, so visible I'm talking about. So if it's empty in here, like completely empty, there's nothing in here, this button will be grayed out, let's say. Okay? Or disabled. All right? Well, how do I do that functionality? So if I wanted that, again, you can see that if I click on the button on the right, right now I'm focused on the lightning bolt. But I can also look at all the events, all the different properties of the button, right? Well, one of them is enabled. If I disable the button, if I change it to false, as an example, and if I run the file, run the program, so I'm disabling the button now, you can see that I can't click on the button at all, right? So it's not enabled. I can't click on it. It's there, it's visible, but it's not enabled. I can, like I said, gray it out. It's actually even looking pretty bad being black on blue, all right? I can't do anything with it. So that is something that I can do at design time. At design time, I can disable a control, okay? So I can enable and disable controls like this. I can also make them visible and invisible. So even though they're on my form, they don't have to be visible all the time. So visible, if I turn this to false, right? And if I press play here, even though the button is on my form, I can't access it. It's not visible. See, it's designed, but I can't do anything. I can't click onto it. It's not only disabled, but it's literally invisible. It's not even included in my build. That's what invisible does. Okay, visible or invisible. So there's a couple ways to control the visibility and accessibility of your controls by changing them from visible false to visible true, which I'm going to do right now, and for making them enabled or disabled. Enabled true or enabled false. Those are the two ways of doing that. Okay? But one thing can depend on another thing. So what I can say is, hey, listen, until I start entering data here, then this is disabled. So I won't allow me to continue, right? So again, I can, by default, I can say that enabled is false. But I can also, remember, anything that I have here from a property perspective, I can also do programmatically. Okay, so this is what I want. When my form loads for the first time, right, I want my button to be disabled. That's what I want it to be. How do I accomplish that? Well, that means that I'm listening for an event on the form object, this thing here, the container, this form container. I'm listening for an event on this thing. And the way to do that is if I double click on the form itself, it generates a load event. This is a lifecycle event for the form. Okay? There's several different lifecycle events. Okay? And I'm going to go into that for a second. But let's suppose that when the form loads, and I'm just going to use the // to do a thing. So the form load event is triggered once when the form loads. Okay, and when the form loads, I want the button, which is my click me button. So I'm going to start typing click me. I know the name of the button. Click me button dot, and it's called enabled, just like it is inside the property list. Enabled is equal to false. All right, so I'm saying, hey, when the form loads, the click me button is now enabled false, so it's not enabled anymore. Okay, so if I go here to my designer, it's right now by default, if I look at my properties, right, you can see that it's enabled to true, right? So you can see that that's what it would have been. But when I run this thing, you're going to see now it starts off grayed out. I can't do anything about it because I've changed my property for this button on the runtime side. Runtime, when I'm running this form, it's changed to false, so I can't do anything with it. Are you with me? So check mark for yes and X for no. Okay, some people understand what I'm doing. Yay, this is a good thing. Thank you for that. All right. So if this triggers only once, right, when my form loads, and I want this event, something that when I start typing in here, this becomes automatically, if I type at least a couple of characters, I think, you know what, my name has to be at least a couple of characters for this, button to be visible. All right, so I can continue. And if it's any time less than a couple of characters, I'm not checking what those characters are, if they're alphanumeric or one in some kind of symbol, right? I'm just checking that there's some kind of alphanumeric characters up here in my name. And then this button should show up, okay? So how do I do that? So if I go back to my properties, you can see that if I click on this text box, I'm just going to pin my properties together. I'm making the properties of one big window so you guys can see it. I can look at different events for the text box. And notice that the default event is the one that's highlighted, which is text changed. So when the text is changed, right, it will trigger an event, whenever I change the text. Now be careful here. That means anytime it's changed. Every single character I type in here, it's going to generate or change this event every single time. Okay, that's one way of doing it. The other way of doing it is if I want to lose focus. So on the JavaScript side, this event is called the blur event, right? When I lose focus, right? When I have focus, this item is the one that's active. It's the active responder. It's actively responding to my clicks or my input or whatever, right? But when I leave this item, right, as an example, and I go somewhere else, let's say go to by tabbing over or something, then I generate another event, and that would be the leave event. So there's enter and leave, okay? Now it's not mouse enter, okay? It's not mouse enter, it's enter and leave. That's what they're called for these kinds of events. So if I enter the box, or if I tab over somewhere else and I leave the box, it generates an event. So there's a bunch of events I can listen for. For now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to listen for the text changed event. Okay, text changed. So I'm going to double click on this, which is going to generate another event named text box text changed. All right, so I got two different events. I got my hello world form event, which is the lifecycle event, which is triggered when the form itself loads. We're going to look at other events that the form can do. And then I've done this one. Now, there's nothing wrong with me moving up this item. So if I want to move my methods around, let's say I don't want my method to be, I want all my form methods to be together, and I want all my my button, my UI control methods to be together. I can do that. I can cut this out, and I can put it here. And as long as it exists here, it's not going to break my designer. Okay, it's not going to break my designer. However, if I was to cut this out right now and go back to my designer, then it would break, right? If I cut it out. Remember we talked about this last day as well. But as long as it exists, this event object, then we're good to go. So this object, this text change event, will trigger anytime I change the text. And what I want to say is, hey, if the length of my text box, so again, if name text box, all right, and again, we know it's some kind of text object that I want to look at, and I want to look at the count. Okay, if my count from my text box, and it says length, to put length in here instead of count, but let's say I go with count for a second, this count. If the count, so it says returns the number of elements in a sequence, right, in the character sequence, okay, and notice if I can also put in length. Length also is good. It's a property. If the length, right, the length of my string, that's what I want to put in here as an example. If it's less than 2, right, then I want to leave my, because I disabled my click me button, I want to leave it disabled. So this would have to be at least greater than 1. If my name text box.length is greater than 1, only then, then I want the click me button enabled to be equal to true, okay? Else, remember we did this last day too, else I want my click me button enabled event to be equal still to false, right? If it's less than, it starts at false, it's enabled false, but it stops, and then it says, a little hint, it says, hey, let's convert it to a question mark colon expression. Again, this is ReSharp or C++ that lets me do that. If I click on this and say convert, it's going to convert it to this format, which I think is a way better way to do things. All right. In fact, this is actually what we want. Click me button enabled is equal to namebox.text.length greater than 1. Right? Why? Because if it's not greater than 1, then this would generate false, which means it would be disabled. This is a great way of doing it instead of putting if else, if else. You don't need to do that. All right. So this is pretty cool. So it says, hey, anytime if I change my text and it goes less than two characters, right, it's going to disable the text box anyway. So I can do it. I start with disabled, and I keep it disabled until I have the proper length. So let's try that. So here I am, and I can't do anything. I type one character, nothing. But as soon as I type a second character, hey, now it's disabled. Enabled. And if I backspace and I delete the character, it's disabled again. That means it needs at least a couple of characters for me to do something. So if I say something like Tom, it's enabled, right? But if I go T and I try and click onto it, nothing, right? 2, that's okay somehow. It doesn't check what's in here. It just checks to see that there's 2 characters. So a little bit of form validation, right? Hello 2. Yay. Okay. And once I change it, it also goes back to this. Okay. Sometimes what we want to do from a debugging perspective is I want to output some data that I'm typing in. And remember, we can't do a console.writeLine. There is no console.writeLine here. Okay, just letting you know. Okay, so there is no console object that we can have access to. However, notice what we had before. We had a debug view, right? So a couple ways I'm going to show you how to debug information here. There is a debug view, all right, here, this view here. Output, see where it says output and it says debug? There's different options here. There's build and there's a debug. This is the one I want, right? So wouldn't it be nice if I can see some output here sometimes? Sometimes I need to do this. I can also use breakpoints and all that stuff like we talked about before. But I want to output to the debug view right here. How do I do that? And I'll show you other ways of debugging as well. Let's stop. So what I could do is I want to print the name text box dot length. Let's say I want to print this, the length of the text box text to the debug view. Then what I could do is do something like, actually let's do it first before we do this. We'll say debug.writeLine and I want to put in the name text box dot length, the length of this in here, and I can also say something like name text box length is, or I can use interpolation, C# interpolation, but I can use a debug.writeLine. Okay, debug.writeLine. What it does is it uses something called system diagnostics, and if it's not on, you can turn it on by including system.diagnostics in there. That's a new thing you have to use. There is no console, so this is the way we would do it. Debug.writeLine. Okay, and if I was to run this thing, right, you can see that when I type in anything now, right, you can see that the name, the next name text box length is 1. The name text box length is 2. Every time I type something, right, I can go back and I can go forward, and every time I do something, it'll generate that event and it'll output to the debug view. All right, so this is a great way of getting output where you don't see it here. The user doesn't see it here. You only see it as a developer over here. Okay. So that's definitely one way of doing it. And so debug is good. The other way to do it is using something called a message box. I don't recommend this. This is just for debugging purposes. You don't want to use message boxes too often. Just like in JavaScript, you don't want to use alerts, right? But it's important sometimes to get feedback that you can see. And from a debugging perspective, what you can do is you can say something like, hey, message box, right? I want to create a new message box. Okay. And my message box, if you think about it, is going to have a couple of things here, right? So I could do this, right? And notice it says in the message box, it says, I want to make a message window, also known as a dialog box. They contain text, buttons, and symbols, and so on. And one thing to do is if I say, whatever I want to show, first I make it, and it tells me that there's some things that I need. It says cannot access private constructor message box here, right? Because that's not how a message box works. Okay. Instead, if I was to create a message box, right, and I said something like message box.show, I can use the message box class itself to show a message box. All right. What message box does is it returns a dialog result, right? So again, notice that the default constructor, it says I want to show a string, the string caption, message box buttons. These are all things that I've got to show, plus a bunch of overloads, right? So if I just put in, as an example, something like the length every time. Now this is every single time I enter data in a box, which is not a good idea. All right. But let's suppose I want to show the name text box, just like the same thing that I put before. Name text box length is da 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 da. Okay, and I want to put it up in a message box instead. Every single time that I print a button, a new message box will pop up. All right. Let's try that and see if it actually builds. So we'll go through here, and you see I type in here, and I start typing T, and all of a sudden there's a message box that shows up that says T, right? And by the way, I can't continue, right? Until this, I click OK by default, right? So if I type another character like O, then message box length is 2. I got to continue. If I type M, message box length is 3, because it keeps generating this message box over and over again. Okay. The question I got is the default value of enabled true or false? For all UI controls, when you put them on your form for the first time, they're all enabled. Enabled true. That's the default value. So you have to make it false if you don't want it to be enabled. Same thing with visibility. If you put a control on a form, by default, it's visible, right? So this is what message box does. Message boxes are a great way of stopping execution of your code or showing certain kind of things. You can also include, if I put comma, you can see there's other constructors. This is an overloaded constructor. And I can include other things in here. For example, the message box buttons that I want to include. So I can say message box buttons dot, and I can decide what kind of buttons I want. I can say if I want an OK cancel, a retry cancel, a yes no, and so on. Let's put an OK cancel. All right, so I want to show the OK cancel buttons. Now once I do that, as an example, I also need to put other things in here, because now I'm inside this constructor. See, this constructor is the one that's highlighted. I also need to put message box icon and a message box default button, right? Or at least the message box icon. That's the default. Message box buttons by itself, I need a caption as well. So something like the caption is got to go second. So let's put that in there. So the caption is like, it's a string that shows something like, what you want to show. So name text box value, right? And then what you can do is, and I'm just going to split this up over a couple of lines here so you can see. So these are the 3 inputs. Once I include message box buttons, I need to kind of put a caption, which is like the title bar of the message box. All right, so if I run this thing now, and if I type anything in here, you can see a message box comes up and it says name text box value, right? As an example. And then I have two buttons, OK, cancel, right? OK, cancel. If I want to know if I pressed OK or cancel or yes or no, whatever, abort, retry, and there's options like that, you can, this show actually returns a dialog result. So if I say something like var result, let's say, is equal to whatever the message box show, whatever I get, if it's OK or cancel, OK would be true, cancel would be false, right? And then if I said true or false, let's just do a test. I'll say if results, then what I want is my debug.writeLine to print off true, right? If the result is positive, right? And what kind of result? Result.OK. If the result is OK, right? Result is equal to dialog result.OK. Then we want the debug.writeLine to be true. Else we want debug.writeLine to say false. I'm just making this up so you can see how it works. And again, we can convert this into an if ternary operator. So if I click on here and I go to here, then it can convert to a ternary operator, which is a one-liner, right? Dialog debug writeLine result is equal to debug dialog result.OK, then output true. That's what the writeLine is going to be. Otherwise, output false. All one line, and it's a beautiful thing. All right, as opposed to if, else, if, and then blah blah. Okay, so if I try this out, and if I say something like A or S, and then it says, hey, look, now take a look over here, because if I press OK, right, it says true, right? And if I press something else, and if I press cancel, right, it says false. So I actually can detect the values of my my dialog box, or my little my little message box. This is a really cool thing, especially if you have something that's really important. Like where you want to use a message box or an alert in JavaScript is something like you want to delete something, right? And you want to indicate to the user, hey, Mr. User or Mrs. User, you know, guess what? If you delete this, it's gone forever. Are you sure? That's a good use of a message box or an alert, all right? Otherwise, if you put alerts like this inside of your file, it should be only for debugging purposes, because it's going to stop operation. In fact, there's two types of forms that we've just talked about. There is something called a modal form, right, which is your message box, and a modeless form, which is your hello world form. A modal form, that's spelled like this, modal, right? A modal form, this message box is a modal form. So that's what happens. The little form that comes up, that's what the message box is. It requires input before your program can continue. This is bad. It interrupts your program flow, okay? So again, you only want to use it when it's absolutely necessary, okay? Or if you're using debugging, you're debugging somehow, okay? Whereas the entire form itself, the form itself, hello world form, is modeless. So this is modeless, right? There is not, you don't need for the form to be clicked or whatever. Now we can create modal forms. I can just change the type to modal as opposed to modeless, right? But for now, all of our forms in the first part are modeless, which means they're not waiting for you to input anything for your program to continue. Okay. So message boxes. So I want to show you how to use this message box stuff. Okay, and there's other awesome things you can include here. For example, message box buttons. You can also include things like message box icon. So let's say I want to include a message box icon that is a, hey, you know, I'm going to warn you, you know, are you ready? Are you sure? Kind of thing. I can do a warning, right? Kind of thing. And there's other things too. Like it says the message box default button. You know, I can specify what that is, you know. So message box default button, as an example, is button 1, right? The first button, right? And notice there's like button 1, button 2, button 3. Button 1 is the OK button, or the positive button. And Button 2 is the middle button, which is the cancel button, as an example. All right, so button 1, if you just press enter, right, it's basically saying that it's going to be okay. Let's try this out and see what I get now for the message box. So again, I'm here and I press button A. It comes up. I get this little triangle now because this is what I generated back down here. Notice I can't even like move this thing. It stops me from doing anything. If I press enter, then it says true. I didn't do anything. Let's say if I go Al, let's say my name is Al, right? My name text box length is 2. If I just press enter, the first button is the one that gets the default button. Okay. So that is message warning. Message box icon warning is the little triangle that says warning. I can change this to anything I want. For example, I want a asterisk. Let's see what that looks like, right? So you can change. You can try some of these. I'm going to show you a couple of them that are that you might see, right? And there's also a hand, right? You might choose other options here, right? It's like, hey, stop, wait, don't go forward. This is an error, right? Kind of thing, as well. And it makes a different sound. The hand is not really a hand. It creates a different sound in the background, and it tells you what it does. This message box contains a symbol consisting of a white X in a circle with a red background, and it's going to make a error sound. The hand, stop, don't do it anymore, right? So. And you can also generate an error. So it looks like the same, but it's going to make, right, same error. Error is the same thing. And by the way, some of these are backwards compatible. They used to use different symbols back in the day, and they've inherited them so that they don't break future iterations of your Windows form. Microsoft is still supporting Windows forms. Exclamation is the other one. Let's do that one. So exclamation. So you can do different things here. So again, it looks to me like a warning, like our exclamation. It does the same kind of background sound as a warning. So I just wanted to show you some of these things that you can do, right? And you can also change these. So instead of OK, cancel, I can say, let's do 3 of them. Yes, no, cancel, or abort, retry, ignore. Let's try that one. Abort, retry, ignore, right? Because right, it'll come up, abort, retry, ignore. 3 buttons instead of 2 buttons, right? I can click ignore. And that would be, if I wanted ignore to be my default, right? If I want ignore to be the one, then I can choose button 1. Okay, sorry, button 3. Button 3 would be ignore, okay? All right, so that is message boxes. I wanted to show you that, and I'm just going to put the message box in here for now with an OK button. You can choose that too. You can say only one button, right? Only the OK button, not OK cancel, just OK. So everything is OK. And I don't care about this if that's true. And maybe we want to give information. So again, we don't want to, alarm anybody. We want to just use information. So the information one looks like that, and this is just for debugging purposes, which means we can comment it out later on. So right, this information, only an OK button, right? By the way, all the forms also have an X at the top. You can also X out of them. And if you X out of them, the default button is the one you specify. Okay, notice it says true, true. Questions around message boxes and debug write line, because you need to do this kind of stuff when you're debugging your forms going forward, guys. It's very important to know how to do this, because you're going to say, I don't know how to debug, I don't know how to get input, I don't know why this is not working the way I want. You can always output to the right to your debug window, which is a good way of doing it. It's silent, but it outputs information for you, the developer. Or if you want something more abrasive, more in your face, then you use a message box. Okay. Okay, I'm going to put this up on GitHub as an example, and then I remove it in my next commit. Okay, so Solution Explorer, sorry, Team Explorer. I'm going to go to Home. I'm going to go to Changes. I'm going to say message, or we'll say debugging example. Debugging example. commit all, home, sync, and push. Okay, but what happens? I mean, I'm doing this, and then I'm going to erase it and do some other thing, right? So I'm going to kind of talk about how do I get back to that other, how do I see my previous commits? I'll talk about that in a second. So I don't care about this anymore. I've done all my debugging. It looks good. I'm happy with this thing, TextChanged. It's a little bit of validation for my form, and I'm creating this little form control. Yay, that's awesome, right? But now I want to add something else. I want to move on, right? So I've done my debugging, and let's say I want to add a little picture box. So I want to go to Toolbox, and I want to go to Picture Box. All right, so let's put a picture box in here, right? And let's suppose I want a picture of a user or some kind of profile icon or something like that. I want to include it. Let's find one. So let's go on the web and go find a profile default image, right? Something like that looks like this. Let's say I want, oh, that looks nice. I want to do this one. Or if you want to keep generic, so it's not a kind of androgynous, so you don't specify man or male or female, you can use something like this, right, as an example, or like this. That might be something good to do. So that's not, you're not specifying, people, you don't want to offend anybody, especially your users. That could be, a lot of them are, half of them are female, right, or they identify as female. So you want to make sure that you hit something that's generic, right, like something like that's like this. All right, so I want to get this icon. Let's say I want to use this one. I'm going to copy this one, or I might save my image as. I'm going to save image as on the downloads area, and let's specify that this is going to be my profile image, right? And we'll say default profile image, save. Okay, but I want to include this default profile image as part of my application. Right now, this little magic little arrow up here on the top, I'm not sure if you guys can see this, there's a little magic arrow that specifies the image, choose image, right? And it's looking inside something called the project resource file, right? Project resource file. I don't have anything in my project resource file, so I can click import. If I click import, then I can specify a location where I can get stuff. For example, it looks at some random location. I want to look at my downloads, and I want to look at my default profile image. All right, so open. There's my default profile image. I've just imported it, and then press OK. Right, when I do that, my default profile image partly appears inside of my picture box. Right, I want it to fit nicely in here, and this little magic arrow on the right actually allows me to do that. It says size mode normal, so obviously this is too big for my image. I can choose size mode. There's a bunch of different ones. One of them is stretch image, which actually stretches it to here. And the bad thing about this is I can make it really skewed. This is a skewed image. Please don't do things like this or like this. Okay, don't do that. That looks terrible. All right. What you want to do instead, okay, let's suppose you want an image to fit inside this area here, let's say, right? And you can go here, and you don't want stretch image. If I go auto size, it auto sizes my box to fit the image. Now I don't have control handles anymore. I can't make it smaller than this if I auto size. This is the actual size of the image that I got. Okay, I don't want it to be this big. The other one, the other option is center image. Center image centers the image. But then what I can do is if I do this, I can scrunch it up. So I see the full size image in the background, but it's centered in my screen wherever I put it. Okay, again, not optimal. So the one I really want is this thing called the bottom one, which is zoom. It's a weird name for it, but what zoom does is if I was to change my image, it actually zooms it and keeps the aspect ratio right. All right, so for example, I want my image to be something like this. Right, there we go. That looks about right for my image. So that's my profile image. And if I run this thing now, you're going to see that it kind of comes up. Okay, there's my profile image. So you can put images like this, any image you want, PNGs, JPEGs, bitmaps, all kinds of other stuff in here as well that you can put in as my image. Okay. So that's the image or picture box. I'm just going to go through some more of these controls now. Okay, so picture box, that's this. We talked about label as well. We've talked about text box. That these three things or four things here. I got my button, my label, my text box, and my picture box are the most common UI elements that you'll see on any form ever, by the way. Sometimes we also want to group things together. All right, for example, I want to group all of these things together inside of another container inside of the form itself. Okay, as an example. Okay, so how do I do that? Well, there is a way of, if you look down inside the toolbox, there is something called containers, and there's something called a group box. Okay, so if I pull a group box in, the group box is an invisible container. You can't see this on the form except for the title. So if I look at the properties of the group box, here's the properties of the group box. You can see it's called group box 1. But let's say this was like user information instead of hello world, my hello world form. So let's call this like user info group box. Remember what I do? Group box, user info group box, right? And I can change the text, the text value. So if I don't want to show a little text value there, I can just take it away. So the default text value can be invisible. But what it's going to show is a little indented divider, right? That's what it's going to show on the form. So if I was just to run this form this way, again, you won't see anything except for like a little raised area, a little border. I'm not sure if you guys can see this in the video, but it looks like really small little border here. Again, we can change that to take it all away, right? So I can go here and I can go to my properties, and you can see that I have a different style. There's if I go to for color, I can make a special color for it. I can change the back color so that that area there on the form has a different color than the rest of the form. Okay, so that is something that I can do. I can choose where, see it says auto size is false. I can make it auto size true, so that means I can wrap stuff that it's containing. I'm going to show you how to do that in a second, right? I can change the cursor when you enter that area. So when I hover over this area here, it can change the cursor to something else, right? And it says flat style is standard. Flat style is standard. I can also make it completely flat, right? So you can't see much depth in it. Let's just pin this for a second. I can also make the flat style pop up, right? Which just changed the style. So if I look at the style of the group box now, it might look different on different windowing systems. Here it doesn't look any different because again this is Windows 10, so it overrides some of the default styles. So this doesn't really do much for us right now. Standard is probably what we want to be anyway. So margins, it has an internal margins, modifier, and padding. It's built-in padding and margins, right, as it is. It's also visible, right? Anything that is inside of the group box, if I turn the group box invisible, everything else inside the group box becomes invisible as well, okay? So how do I add stuff to the group box? Well, let's make it so that it is sized correctly. Notice it's layered on top of these things. I can change the layer later on. But for now, what I want to do is I want to just drag and drop some of these things inside of the group box. Okay, so let's say drag this in the group box and drag this in the group box. So this two parts. These parts are not part of the group box, but these parts are. Now what I can do is I can drag these two parts together, right? I can resize the group box so it shows the same information, right? There's my information. I can also change the element's location relative to the group box, right? Not to the form itself. It's relative to the group box now, right? So how it's going to look inside the group box, right? There it is. So you can see how that is going to look there. So I can modify, I can separate information on my form wherever I want. This is useful for moving stuff around. I want to move my group box over there. I can move both those elements at the same time. And wherever I want them, they'll be. I can also center them relative to the form now, or whatever, right? If I double click on this, I also create an event as well. I can create events for that when I hover over the group box, it does certain things. All kinds of lovely control that it gives you. So group box is just a container. The group box contains other stuff. Okay, anything you drag in there. Okay, so that's kind of some of that stuff that is there. Okay, let's save this form. Let's run it and let's see what happens. So see what it looks like. There we go. So you can see that there's a slight outline. It's hard to see, but there's a slight outline for your name. So it's separated from everything else. It's still, if you notice, it's still hidden. If I start typing, it lights up. It still changes everything as before. No problem. Okay. If I want to, I can subtly change the background so it's not the same color. So if I say, hey, you know what, this group box is going to be slightly darker or whatever, I can change the back color property, right, of the group box only to another color that I like. So let's say, for example, I want it to be, I don't know, some light gray color like this. It kind of looks weird, but if I want to, I can totally do that. I can say, okay, here's my light gray background. And then this color here, which is my label, would also have to be that. So it kind of doesn't look like this. I can go to my label. Instead of my background color being control, I can change my background color to that light gray color, right? So it hides that area. So now you can see that the group box itself has a specific color that's different than the rest of my form. And that's how you would do stuff like that. Okay. Awesome. You can also use a background image for the group box instead of background color. So let's say, for example, I had a wild image that I wanted to put in here or something that looks nice. I can do that, and it's only going to fit inside here. Once I load a background image, it can skew, and I can display it just like I would a picture box. So it has that capability. Same thing with buttons. Buttons can actually be button images. I can have an image button as opposed to a button that has text inside of it. Okay, so lots of options here in terms of our, the way we create our forms. Again, the newer paradigm for creating Windows user interfaces have more options actually and more control than this, but this is pretty good. All right. Again, if you want to be more organized with your form, a lot of times what we do with the form like this is make sure that all the controls are aligned together. So if I want the control example to be aligned with one another, let's say this might look a little better if I want this centered compared to if this was way over here, right? And I also have a lot of this. One thing I'm going to mark you guys on when you come to making user interfaces is this part right here. This area here and around the user interface, around here, as an example, is called white space, even though it's not really white. It's empty space here, empty space here, empty space here, lots of white space. And guess what? Your eye, naturally, when it comes to user interfaces, it is drawn by the white space on a form. So it's drawn here and here and here, not to this by any means. This is taking a lot of attention. So a lot of times what we want to do is if you want to make the form only this big, you want to change the size of the form so that it eliminates some of this white space, so that the form is a little bit more bounded to the stuff that you're asking the user to do, right? Or add other elements in there to fill in the white space. That's what you want to do. Okay, so let's say for example, I want to enter your name, and there's some kind of message. This is kind of a simple example, a very silly example. Maybe I want to make this bigger. The bigger I make this, though, you don't want it to be skewed, and you want it to be balanced with the rest. So notice the division, the space between here and here. You want to be sensitive to that space, right? When it comes to designing elements, you don't want to put a bigger space than here to here. No, notice this big space here, and there's a small space up here. Again, there's not a balance between all these elements, and what you can do is you can adjust that by moving things around until you feel there is a balance between elements by eye, and then you can adjust them numerically over here on the right if you really want to make sure that everything is balanced, as opposed to just your feel of how it looks, the form itself. Okay, again, you may want to reduce some of this so that it kind of scales the form to something that is it looks pretty good. Okay, Okay, so kind of good border, good spacing between all the elements. Good. This is where I want my form to be. I think for this particular form, this hello world form, I've got a little form that pops up that looks like this. I can put my name in and I can say hello Tom. Yay, I've made an awesome form. But this is an example of the first form that you would create. Okay. Hey, let's put this up on GitHub now, and I'm going to show you how you can get to the other stuff on GitHub that we've had. So I'm going to go to Team Explorer. I'm going to go to Home, and notice it says, if I go to Changes, I've modified my resource designer and my resources.resx. Okay, I've added a default profile image.jpg inside my resources folder, because that's what I did with this thing. I modified my hello world form and my hello world form designer because I've added this picture box element and the group box. That's what I've done. So these are all things that I've done. And let me say I added profile picture or image and group box. Right? So once I've done that, I commit all, home, sync, and push. But now you're going to say, but Tom, you give us an example of a message box and it's gone because I've taken it out, right? There is no message box anymore in here. And what if I wanted a message box example? It's somewhere in here, right? Yes, you're right. And the great thing about this is you can go up on GitHub. Let's go on GitHub here. So github.com/Centennial College. You can see that this is the one we're working on right here. Whoa, where did it go on GitHub? Here it is. So you can see that here my object has been changed 40 seconds ago, right? So this is the last commit. I've got, again, in terms of number of commits, I've got 8 commits that I've made on this particular object, 8 commits, okay? And you can see that it says added profile image and group box. But if I click on the commits, this part, the commits, you can see that if I want to look at my debugging example, if I click on any one of these things on the left on GitHub, if I click this, it'll show me all of the files that have changed. So if you look on the left, it'll say these are the green things are things that I've added, and it'll tell you for each of the files that I've modified what has been added or removed. Red is removed. You know, as an example, green has been added, right? And you can see a plus and a minus. That's what GitHub does for you. It tells you. Blue, as an example, are just kind of areas that it shows you where things, you can move these sections up and down. They don't really affect anything. That shows you what have been things that have been changed. Okay. However, let's go back one. If you click on these numbers here, right, or this thing here, right? These numbers actually show you the number, but this thing here actually shows you the code that existed as of that point. So see with this debugging example, it's a snapshot. If I click on this little link up here in your repository, I can see the code as it was back then. So if I look inside here, and now if I look inside of my hello world form, indeed, I'm going to see my message box. Here it is. Look, here's my message box show, all that stuff, right? Because that's what it was back then when I made that snapshot. Okay, so that's why GitHub is awesome, because it allows you to go back and it tells you this is where I'm looking. I'm looking at this particular commit. I can also look at the master branch, and if I look at the master branch for this particular file, now that's gone. It doesn't show that anymore, okay? Because we don't have that in our master branch. We only have that in that particular commit. Our master branch points to the current commit, the head of our GitHub repo. Okay. Questions around this? Because I know some people are like, well, I want to get an example, but how do I do that? Well, I mean, it's really simple. All you need to do is go to your code under that particular repo, look at your commits, right? Take a look at the left if you've already made a snapshot of some of these things. For example, when I added the class diagram, when I added the text box, we can go all the way back to that point. And I can always revert back to that, commit. I can delete all these things, and this is where I can be back to there. I don't want to do that, but I could, okay? But here, this thing here, this allows us to look at the code as of that particular commit, which is kind of cool. All right, so that is Git and GitHub and also different objects. So here it talks about how to programmatically change the font to something else. So I want to look at the font of, first you would create a font programmatically, and then you could change the font's label to this object that you've created. Because remember, there's a couple ways to do this. I can make it equal to big font, or I can just do an anonymous new font right here in this line. Okay, so let me show you that. So let's say on runtime, when I run this thing, as an example, I want my hello world object, instead of it having Microsoft Sans Serif, which is, this is the font that it has, right? You can see that I have a lot of other fonts that are available to me, right? For example, something like a really boring Consolus, right? Here's Consolus that I want to use. I want to use Consolus, and I want it to be, I don't know, 24 as opposed to 20, okay? So if I wanted to do that on runtime, right, what I can do, again, in the hello world form, when the form loads, I can change the font of that particular item, right? So we know that the welcome label, right, dot font is the thing we want to access. So that is the property we want to access. We want to make it so that it's a new font. And if I type a new font as an example, it's that other font that I was talking about before. And we have an example of that here, where we have the name of the font and the size, right? So the name of the font should be something like Consolus, and then the size is what we all, the other thing that we need, which is going to be something like, let's say we said 24.0f. Okay, so those are the two requirements, right? Consolus, notice it says represents text as a sequence. This is okay. This is the family name. This is the size in ems. Okay, so if I did this, it's a one and done. I've changed my font type to Consolus and my font size to 24. There's other options here for font. Notice I didn't go system.font. I didn't do that kind of whole namespace thing, because up here we've included system.drawing, right? Because this is using system.drawing, and if I go to this, you can see that system.drawing is the namespace that we're using. I can just use font. I don't have to be explicit and say system.drawing.font. And if I run this thing, you can see now that by default my font becomes Hello World, which is like a Consolus font, a console font. And if I type Tom and click Hello, it says Hello Tom. So you can change font or properties programmatically inside of my code. That's what that does. Okay, cool. So that's this. It talks about how to do that by making a selection. There's other things you can do with fonts. Link labels. You can make a link label which is like a label, but it links to other resources such as web pages and so on. We can do that using a link label. There's a lot of stuff in here that tell you how this works. You can specify a place where you want to look. Typically, we don't want to do that. Color to the form, we can change the color class. Checkbox and radio buttons are important. That's kind of a true false. So, let's say I want a checkbox, we'll do that one. Checkbox where I say, I want to see the, my greeting, right? But I only want to see my greeting if I press the checkbox. I'm just going to move these down here for a second. Hey, wouldn't this be nice if I put my greeting, kind of stuff inside of another group box so I can move it together, so I don't have to do all this work that I just did? It makes sense, right? So I'm going to go to Toolbox. I'm going to add another container. So let's go to containers. I'm going to go to group box, drag a group box in here, align it with this. In my properties, right? I'm going to make it invisible though. In my properties, what I want to do is I want to take away group box 1. I don't want to have my text in there. Change this to the type of group box, which is my greeting group box. That's what it is. So any greeting group box stuff, that's what I'm going to have in there, which is the button and the label. So I can put the label inside there, as well as the button inside there, right inside the group box. Let's make sure that that label is here for a second. Notice the label is not part of the group box right now. I'm going to make it part of the group box by just dragging it in. There we go. and then dragging this around here. Just aligning the label here. I want to make it so that the label fits inside the group box. There we go. Label is now aligned in the group box. And then my button is aligned in the group box. Okay, click me. The hello world, click me. Now, remember I talked about how group boxes are really cool because you can do a lot with them? You can. Just to make sure that I just align this label a little bit smaller so that way I can fit everything I want to do in here, right? So a little bit tighter is what I'm doing. And it may not look great, but I'm going to try and do it so that I can do this stuff. Okay, now that I've got this, I can move this whole thing down, right? And let us use a toolbox button, which is our checkbox. I'll put our checkbox in there. And my checkbox is going to basically say, and by the way, I can change my color. So my color is white right now, which is my for color for my checkbox. Let's change the name of my checkbox to greeter, or greeting checkbox. Greeting checkbox, right? So that's what it's called, greeting checkbox. And I want to change my for color, right? So my for color is my foreground color, which is the color of my text. I want to change my foreground color to black. Again, you can make it system black, active caption text, so you can see it. And we can say something like show greeting. Show greeting. All right. By default, we can make it checked. So we can say one thing that checkboxes have that other things don't have, it's a different kind of control. It has a unique checked property. By default, the check state is false. We can make it so that it is true. All right. So checked is true by default. And then when I want to make a little event that when I uncheck the box, this becomes invisible. So let's double click on this. It's going to create an event that says when the CHECKCHANGED event triggers from my greeting text, checkbox. We know which one it is. Let's move this one up so it's part of our UI events right here, and not our form events. And we can separate that. We can say that this is our form events area, and this up here, this is us doing it. We don't, the form is not going to do it for us. We have to kind of do. These are our UI events. These are all the UI events. These are our form events. We can move this around so we can kind of tell the user who's using our stuff how it works. We can say when the greeting checkbox CHECKCHANGED is changed. If we can say our greeting checkbox, if it's true, what we want to do is we make our visibility to false, otherwise it's true. So if that's true, let's look at this and make a ternary operator. We want to say that the greeting group box dot visible is equal to our greeting checkbox true or not, right? If it's check state, if it's checked, all right? If it's checked, it's visible. If it's unchecked, it's invisible. So let's get rid of this little parentheses. We can do it in one. Whatever the check state is the visibility state of the group box. Okay, so let's try this out. And if I run this thing now, you'll see that my check state is on, it's showing, but if my check state is off, the whole thing disappears. So I can show my greeting and turn these things. I can turn controls on and off by just using this checkbox. Cool? All right, let's put this up on GitHub because this is where I'm going to stop for today. So Team Explorer, I'm going to go home. Home. Changes, right? These are the things I changed. I'm going to say added greeting checkbox, right? And also the container. Commit all, home, sync, and push. And again, this is the workflow, guys. Notice I make a commit and then I push it. Now you don't have to push all your commits all at once. You can push them up later. But I find that if I just I keep on pushing these commits, they're just my repository is up to date. Especially if I'm working alone. Okay, so there you go. There's my little file, right? It's pretty cool. It's nothing that's too crazy, and it's got a few events. Today we talked about the load event for the form. We talked about some additional controls, a picture box as well as a checkbox. We modified the font, and there's a lot of other things that are inside of this PowerPoint. I mean, here we're only at page 18 or 19 out of 69. We can't possibly cover everything, as an example, in one. We're going to cover all this stuff, guys, but we're going to do it step by step every week. I'm going to come back to this this PowerPoint because it has a lot of really cool information. When I give you your next assignment, it'll be based on some of the stuff that I've given you here. Okay? Questions around the stuff that we did today with more UI controls. We talked about a bunch of stuff, some debugging. We talked about different kinds of controls you can put on, the most common controls that I've given you kind of on a form. And I've also talked about form UI best practices in terms of how to lay out forms and all kinds of stuff like that. We're also going to be talking about later on in this semester how to do things like planning your form. How do I plan my form or my user interfaces? Because you want to give the user the best user experience possible. And the way to do that is to create things like wireframes, which is going to be part of something that I'm going to be asking for your next assignments. Okay. All right, questions. I'm going to take questions before we stop. We're at the end for today, and I want to make sure that I have answer any questions that you may have specifically for this lesson, not for the midterm tests. Okay, if there's no questions for this lesson, now, what about questions for the midterm test? I want to record these things because I know people are going to have similar questions. Any questions for the midterm test? Yes, Hussam. Why don't you type in a chat? Can I open my mic, sir? Yeah, if we do that, let me just stop recording then, and I'll take questions. So I'm going to stop recording here, and I'll see the people on the video on the next video, which is going to be next Monday.